Hi everyone, welcome back to Life on the Magic Mountain. I'm going to have to be careful today. I should have positioned myself better because I'm blocking the sun, and if I move a little, you're going to see nothing but the sun. Okay, so today I'm doing something a little different. I finished up the series that were actually recorded at Schatz Alp, so I won't be able to return to those until I myself return to Schatz Alp sometime in the next few months. There it goes. Okay, with the sun, I mean. But I'm going to continue on with the Magic Mountain and comparing Thomas Mann's famous novel, The Magic Mountain, with my research into Schatz Alp and life at a tuberculosis sanatorium during the sanatorium era, during the period when Hans Castorp would have been there between 1907 and 1914, and what life was really like, and also a little bit of what a life was like between 1939 and 1942 for the only Schatz Alp patient I know of who left a diary. So far, I'm always hoping to find more diaries and letters and that sort of thing. Who is Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia, not only the only Schatz Alp diarist, but possibly the most famous patient who ever stayed there. And I should say, in case you're coming to this series for the first time, that I myself am, for several months a year, the historian in residence at Schatz Alp, which is now a hotel, but was a sanatorium, and certainly the most luxurious sanatorium in Davos and possibly in the world, with a glittering clientele. Okay, so as I said, I'm doing something a little different today because we're going to talk about another book that you could see as a kind of parallel to the Magic Mountain. So I did another one of these short videos on another book before, on Erich Kästner's Der Zauberlehrling. And this book that was published in 1927 is about Davos from the viewpoint of winter sport. So it's presenting Davos to the reader not as a sanatorium town, although it still was at that time, but as a winter sport a winter sport resort. And so it's lighthearted. It contains elements of magical realism, and it presents Davos in a very attractive and appealing light. And in fact, it was actually commissioned as a response to the Magic Mountain, so that readers would see that there was another side to the town, and that was very much the case. Davos had a really glittering winter season, with, again, like at Schatz Alp, with royals and celebrities, movie stars, that sort of thing, who came not for health reasons, but for the social and aspect in the winter sport. So this is a very good book. It's only available in German, as far as I know. It definitely hasn't been translated into English. And I have another book here that is not a parallel book, really, to the Magic Mountain, although there are certain aspects that connect it to the Magic Mountain that make me want to talk about it just briefly today. This is a Russian novel by an author named Goncharev, and the name of the novel is Oblomov. Oblomov is the surname of the main character. And what it has in common with the Magic Mountain, it's set in St. Petersburg and in the countryside in Russia. And what it has in common with the Magic Mountain is that the main character, Ilya Oblomov, is a person who has embarked upon a career in the civil servant. He's a nobleman. It was written during the time when there was still serfdom in Russia. And so he owned an estate with something like 250 souls, as they called them, meaning serfs or essentially slaves. But he lived in the city off the income from his estate. But people of his class typically did work in the civil service, and he tries that for 2 years, and he finds it so exhausting that then he retreats to his apartment and never goes out, really even for social occasions, because he doesn't want to have to make any effort at all. And he is there's a type of Russian literary character called Alishny Человек, a superfluous man, and Oblomov is one of those. And you could say that Hans Castorp is also one of those, although that is not a type that fits into German literature. So even though Hans Castorp is, like Oblomov, someone who's decided that the world of work is not for him, he still makes an effort in life. He still pursues other things. While he's at Schatzalp, he makes some very impressive studies of things like plant biology and human biology, and he philosophizes and he grows as a person. And in the case of Oblomov, there's just not much room for growth, if any. But Mann talks about the sort of the superfluous man at a tuberculosis sanatorium. Hans Castorp meets young people who are there, who have no notion of having a future in any way, and so they just live in a state of complete superfluousness, and they actually relish that aspect of their lives. So this book, Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain is sort of in between. It's not really lighthearted and presenting a flattering picture of Davos in the same way that Der Zauberlehrling is. But despite the fact that people in Davos reacted negatively to Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, it's still, I think somebody reading it today would have the idea of, yeah, I want to go to this place. It sounds beautiful. It sounds lovely. I want to go there. It has rich historical tradition. Maybe people reading it at that time when it was published in 1924, 100 years ago, weren't sort of thinking of it along those lines. But at any rate, the main quibble that people in Davos had with the Magic Mountain was that it presented the sanatoriums as sometime indulging in sort of subterfuge to keep healthy patients there at the expensive sanatoriums for years sometimes, and to keep them there so that they could make money, even though they were also providing genuine medical care and making a difference in the lives of consumptive people with tuberculosis, and offering the best care that money could buy at that time. There was also this other side of things where some patients were perfectly healthy and the doctors knew it, and they kept them there anyway. They found ways to keep them there anyway. So the book we're talking about today is, if the Kestner book is on the positive end of the spectrum and the Magic Mountain is in the middle, well, the book today is very much on the negative end of the spectrum. It was published before the Magic Mountain in 1917, but it didn't. So the author, I should have started with that, was named Alfred Henschke, and he used the pseudonym Klabund. Somebody told me how to pronounce that, but I don't remember. He was German, and he himself, unlike either Thomas Mann or Kestner, he himself had tuberculosis. He was in Davos as a patient, and he ultimately died in Davos, although he also left for a while, but he came back, and he ultimately died in Davos. So he has a very, very different perspective. And his book is quite a melancholy one and quite depressing, written by someone who seems to have either been depressed while he was writing it or understood very well what that was like. And more like Oblomov than Hans Castorp, the main character, Sylvester, and his friends are people who think of themselves as not having a future. And that was one of the aspects of the Russian superfluous man that made him superfluous. He didn't feel like he had a future. So, yeah, Hans Castorp never faced that particular existential crisis. He didn't like the profession that he'd gone into, but he didn't look at himself and think of himself as a man with no future. And Sylvester and his friends in this book do. And I stupidly didn't start by giving you the name of the book. The name of the book is Die Krankheit, eine Erzählung. So the illness, referring to tuberculosis, and then a story, I think, is an adequate translation of that, hopefully. Because this book, again, like the Kessner book, is not available in English. And so Klabund did not have, I had started to say, Klabund did not have the standing in the world of German literature or international literature that Thomas Mann had. So in a sense, people in Davos who disliked and saw as destructive his presentation of the town in Die Krankheit were not as concerned about this book that sort of was under the radar with the reading public en large. And unlike The Magic Mountain, that made a big splash and everybody knew about it. So, yeah, okay. So this book was published in 1917, so right after the war, and people had other things on their minds, and it actually does not refer to the war. It sort of is presented in, the war just doesn't come into it. It's sort of a non-specific time when, yeah, the war just doesn't come into it. And Klabund actually died in 1928, so he had about another 11 years to live after this book was published. So I want to start out just with a beautiful scene from the book, and I will read my own translation of it, and I apologize in advance, of course, for any inadequacies in my translation. I am not really I'm certainly not a fluent German speaker, and my reading leaves something to be desired, but I try to be as scrupulous and meticulous as possible in looking for translation programs, good ones that I can use, and augmenting them, not just taking the translation directly, but augmenting them with my own knowledge of the language and literature. So, anyway, I do apologize in advance for any inadequacies. So this is a scene that it takes place relatively early in the book, and our hero, Sylvester, is leaving, taking a morning walk, going out of his pension. He apparently can't afford an actual sanatorium, so he lives in a private pension where all the other guests are also sufferers of tuberculosis. And he goes out early one morning, and he discovers that a young woman, is following him, and he doesn't know her. He's never seen her before, but she's very persistently following him as he walks in the direction of Davos Platz. And she gets closer and closer, and eventually she actually touches him on the back of the head, and he finally has to stop and, find out what the heck is going on. So here's that scene. Sylvester says, "What do you want from me?" The girl laughed softly. "You. How do you make this demand on me?" "I have the greatest right to you." "What right?" "The right of the dying person." They stepped under a lantern. Sylvester looked at her pretty but evil face. Her breath cut through the cold winter air with an even more icy breath. Her body rattled like an engine. "He's purring," said the girl. "One of my lungs is completely gone, and my other 3/4. I'm dying. I'm already halfway in the coffin. Only my mouth still shines in life." That's not a correct translation. Anyway, "I'm so afraid of loneliness. Kiss me." A cocotte with an old man's head, scenting the foul breath of her decaying mouth with wild perfume, skipped across the promenade. 2 elegant young gentlemen ran behind her, breathless and coughing. The moon hung wrinkled like an American dried fruit in the haze of the night. Okay, sorry about that little lapse in the translation. So it's a separate woman who runs across the street with these 2 elegant young men in pursuit. She is a separate woman from the woman that taps Sylvester on the back of the head. And she tells Sylvester, just to clarify, that what she wants is him, meaning she, wants to jump into bed with him. She wants to just sort of have him as a random hookup. And when he asks her what right she has to ask that of him, she, of course, says the right of the dying person. And she has lost the use of one lung, and the other lung is 3/4 gone. And, I'm sure she figures she'll be dead in less than a year, maybe in a month or something. And that's what gives her the license to sexually proposition a man on the street in Davos. And then he sees sort of a duplicate of that scene, although this time it is a young woman with an old man's head. So the disease has not made her beautiful, and she's being pursued by these 2 elegant gentlemen, and it's a lark for all of them. She's not being pursued in an aggressive way, and apparently as she passes, Sylvester smells her breath, or he's met other women like her, or it's the woman who wants to kiss him. I'm not sure about that, but he refers to scenting the foul breath of her decaying mouth with wild perfume. So it's not that he smells it. Well, he must smell it, but it's that she's using some kind of mouthwash or mouth spray to disguise her foul breath. And so this is much less romanticized than anything that Thomas Mann presents in The Magic Mountain. This is really getting down to what it was like to have tuberculosis, not for the squeamish. And in fact, in his diary entries, Grand Duke Dmitri notes how foul his breath was and what an embarrassment that was to him, and that he feels like his breath is like the breath, or the taste of his mouth is cadaverous. I think that's the word he uses. So even though we think of tuberculosis, when we look back at 19th century presentations of it, we think about these very romanticized images of beautiful people with the beautiful red hectic flush in their cheeks from the fever, and they're slim. And that is more the presentation of that we get in The Magic Mountain. So Hans Castorp, the main character, does meet eventually. He decides that he's going to take it on himself to go to the rooms of dying people. And again, there's this sort of romanticized view of them. And he grew up with a romanticized view of death because of being exposed to the deaths of relatives, including his parents and his grandfather, at such a young age, and seeing their coffin and finding something sort of ennobling about that. So this book, Die Krankheit, is the opposite of that. And we get some of the same depression and some of the same sense that everything is sordid amongst these people with tuberculosis. Not in the town itself, but in the fact that these people are superfluous in this way that kind of gives them a sense of Well, why not just do whatever we want and not worry about it? And Dmitri uses that word all the time. Whenever he's at a gathering, predictably, whenever he's at a gathering of his fellow patients, he uses that word sorted, and he even breaks from his Russian to use that word in English. Apparently, it had more weight with him when he used it in English. Okay, so having done that dramatic scene, I will tell you a little bit more about the book. So the book is actually a love story between Sylvester and a woman who is an actress. And she is dying. She's much closer to death than Sylvester does. And in fact, spoiler alert, Sylvester actually survives. He recovers his health. Unlike Clobland, he goes back to the world of work and normality, but his girlfriend, the actress, dies, and the book toward the end becomes very much a melodrama, and it's just not on the level of great literature. It's literature, and it has some achingly beautiful prose and some very moving and brilliant scenes like the one I just read, but it's not on the level of great literature, primarily because it descends into melodrama, and the actress actually drops dead suddenly in her lover's arm, or yeah. So hold on a minute. I need that muted. Sorry about that. Constant interruptions. Okay, so what was I saying? Yeah, it turns into a melodrama. Anyway, she's an actress, and she's determined to have one last hurrah, she's organized a play in Davos, in a theater in Davos, and she's going to perform the starring role in that play. So you can kind of see the direction that that's going in. And Sylvester is also in the play. So some interesting things about this. I don't know what Clobland's mindset was, but he makes a couple of references to where he links Davos to the United States for some reason. So the moon looks like a dried fruit. In the haze. I thought this was early morning, but I guess it's actually late at night that he goes out and has this encounter, and the moon is hanging there like an American dried fruit in the haze of the night. And then he makes another reference to comparing the mountains in Davos actually to the Rocky Mountains. So I am looking for that. I will probably have to come back to it, or I left it out of my notes. But yes, he makes a comparison that the mountains look like they are on the edge of America and on the edge of the world. No, that they look like the Rocky Mountains and they look like they're on the edge of the world. So this is very much the perspective of someone who's looking at the mountains and not saying, oh, this is such a beautiful vista, but someone who is profoundly depressed. And, if you really want to understand what life was like during the sanatorium era in Davos, then you really need all of these perspectives. You need the perspective of winter sport. You need the perspective of someone who is sort of a dilettante with the disease and not really in danger of dying from it and can enjoy himself. And you need the perspective of someone who is thinking, I have no future, because all of those currents were so very strongly present. All right, so one of the things that you have with this book, with all three books, is they very accurately present the people one encounters in Davos as being very broadly international, coming from all over the world. And in fact, in Die Krankheit, there's even a Japanese patient. He's actually not a patient. He's a medical assistant, but he's a friend with the patients, and he pals around with them, and he works at one of the sanatoriums. And there were one or two, I think there were two Japanese patients at Schatzalp between 1901 and 1914, which is where I have temporarily halted my research on the patients that were there until I get back to Davos. So it's not at all far-fetched. And in fact, he gives this description of a street scene in Davos. The passers-by that he sees on the street: serious Germans, flighty Italians, sedate Dutchmen, chirping Brazilians, fragrant French women, dark Russians. They all strolled along Promenade with the measured steps of patience, going from the post office, past the Kurhaus and the glittering shops, to the Grand Hotel Belvedere and back again. So they're making this walk, and we don't know, these could well be, these are healthy people they're not the tourists, they're not the winter sport people, they're healthy people healthy enough. I mean, they have tuberculosis, but they're more, at this point, at any rate, they're more like Hans Castorp. They can get out, they can take walks, and apparently this was a popular stroll that patients took. So they start at the old post office at the far end of Davos Platz of Promenadestrasse, and then they walk to the Hotel Belvedere, which has the glittering shops, and it has bars and all kinds of celebrity winter sport guests. It was not a sanatorium. So they make that walk, and then they go back again, and they pass the Kurhaus, which was another glittering establishment, and one that was specifically connected to Schatzalp, because Schatzalp uniquely had included not only a first-rate sanatorium, but also had a restaurant and the Kurhaus that were part of the glittering winter sport scene. So that was kind of an interesting combination of things. So that is Klabun's description of a typical street scene. The main street through Davos is called the Promenade, and very aptly so, because to this day it is kind of a promenade, and it's excellent. You no longer have tuberculosis, of course, so now it's just winter sport and summer sport, and it's brilliant. It's wonderful. And I always miss it. I usually walk down from Schatzalp or take the funicular down once a day, and I enjoy taking walks along Promenade as well. And if you want the more scenic part, you can go along the Hohe Promenade, which runs parallel to Promenadestrasse, but it is further up the mountain slope. It's not in the valley, and you have a brilliant view from there. And as I say, it runs level, so it runs parallel, so it's level, but it's on the mountain slope, and you get a great view. Okay, so, and in the initial scene of the book, so Sylvester and some of the other characters in the book are staying at a pension called the Edelweiss, that is run by a couple, a married couple. They're Germans, and their nicknames are Pneumo and Thorax, because they have both had the artificial pneumothorax operation, which was one of the forms of treatment for tuberculosis at that time. And Thomas Mann talks about it in The Magic Mountain. And on his first day at the sanatorium, Hans Castorp encounters a group of young people called the Half Lung Club, because they've all had this artificial lung collapse to prevent the tuberculosis from spreading, from closing up tuberculous cavities in the lungs. So this married couple have both had that operation, and they are some of the first people in Davos to have had that operation. And they talk about it all the time. So they have these these nicknames. I can't remember which is pneumor and which is thorax, but that's how they're referred to in the book. And so they have this pension for sick people, in fact, sometimes even dying people who can't or don't wish to, can't afford or can't wish to, or don't wish to go to sanatoriums. But some of Sylvester's friends are patients in a fictional sanatorium called Beau Rivage. And it sounds like Beau Rivage is more or less based on Wald Sanatorium, just like in the Magic Mountain, the Berghof is based on Wald Sanatorium. So based on the location, it sounds like that's where it is. And there's one fantastic scene where Sylvester is invited by male friends. It's strictly a stag evening, and he goes up to Beau Rivage, and the circle of friends is very international. They are all from different countries. It's hosted by a Bulgarian who's a patient at the hotel, and the Japanese man has been invited. And so it's unlike Joachim in the Magic Mountain tells Hans Castorp that the nationalities don't really mix. But that's just Joachim. Joachim is very much a German chauvinist, and he just doesn't want to mix with other nationalities. But Hans Castorp kind of brings him out of that, because Hans Castorp is very open to it and does develop an international circle of friends. So what they do on that evening at the Beau Rivage, what Sylvester does with his friends there is they play poker all night long. They play poker and they drink. They order drinks. They order alcohol to be brought to the room and food. And so they have a party, and it's not, nobody tries to stop it. The doctors and the nurses don't come in and say, hey, to the Bulgarian man, you need to go to bed now, or you need to go out on the balcony and do your cure. You can't party all night long. That's not going to help you recover from this disease. But apparently, in some sanatoriums, people did that. And in Schatzalp, they did that to a certain extent, but I think not having other diaries than Dimitri's, Dimitri did not want to do that. He found, as I said, it sordid to be, spending festive evenings with fellow patients. He wanted to get better. So he was more like Joachim. In the Magic Mountain, Joachim is very focused on doing his cure and getting better. Whereas Hans Castorp and other patients are not. And in fact, on a couple of occasions, on one big occasion, there's a party at Schatzalp hosted by this very wealthy and flamboyant character, Herr Pieperkorn, and he hosts this party. He calls for all kinds of things at the restaurant, alcohol, gourmet food, rich gourmet food, and it's all sort of done after the doctors have gone to bed. And there's a sense that, the doctors try to turn a blind eye to these things. But if it's too much in their face, then they have to shut it down. But otherwise, if you can do it sometime when they're not right directly present, then yeah, you can do it. So there were strict sanatoriums, and the most well-known of those in Davos was called Dr. Turban's sanatorium. And if you went to that sanatorium, you obeyed the rules. So anyway, it had a glittering clientele like Schatzalp did. But if you chose to go to that sanatorium, or if you were a young person and a parent sent you to that sanatorium, you would either obey the rules or you would be told to go elsewhere. Okay. Here is also an interesting statement made by Klabund. Consumption is not a disease at all. It is a state of body and soul. And apparently this was an idea that some of the patients had at that time, and it was very much in keeping with this overall perception, and I would say misconception, of what tuberculosis was. And even though Klabund shows the ugly side of things, he also is stuck in this mindset of that tuberculosis is a disease that can also refine people, and it's a soul disease. And he kind of offers this without realizing the contradiction side by side with the idea of, the ugliness and the sordidness. So that's a little odd, and I have in the past and will again recommend Susan Sontag's book, Illness as Metaphor, in which she talks about some of these ideas about tuberculosis. And also in the case of Sylvester, his actress girlfriend, his other friends, they are all intellectuals and artists. And it makes sense that Claublund would write characters like that, because those were the people that he himself was around. He was an intellectual and a writer, and his friends in Davos were intellectuals and writers. But at the same time, he's still playing into that idea that tuberculosis is a disease that's linked either on the one hand to poverty and dirtiness and negative things, but also on the other hand to a refined soul and sensibilities and artistic talent and that sort of thing. Okay, so I'm going to read, this has gone way too long, I'm going to read one more paragraph from the book just because I think it's so beautiful. Again, talking about, what it's like to be someone who conceives himself as having to live in the moment because he has no future. All right. We have long since drowned, but we still walk across the seabed as if we were alive, adorned with pearls and golden chains. The sky billows above us, and the delicate starfish shine. It gathers heavily around our limbs like water. We can no longer move our hands, and we can only walk slowly, very slowly, in the thick tide. Cure step. And our eyes try to penetrate to the surface of the sea, to the sky, but they are almost blinded by all the staring into the sky. So cure step is the best I can do as a translation, and he seems to be indicating that people with tuberculosis walked in a different way. Not as vigorously, I would assume, maybe with slower and shorter steps than the athletic people who were there for the winter sport. Okay, and then the specific reference to Schatzalp. From the Schatzalp bobsleigh track that passed in front of the guest house, the monotonous calls, "Bob, Bob, Bob," rang out to his ear, which was protected from the cold by woolen earmuffs, and they sounded like the cries of drowning people begging for help. Wow, okay, that's intense. So, the photographs I have of the Schatzalp bobsled track taken by patients who were at Schatzalp in 1914 and 1910 from photo albums I have show the bobsleds in a very positive light, people having fun, they're out in the brisk air, they're enjoying themselves, the patients are enjoying themselves, and also in the Kestner book. And they talk about the great fun of the bobsledding, and even in Thomas Mann's book, Joachim and Hans Castorp take an impoverished young woman who is herself dying, and they go to watch the bobsled races at Schatzalp, and they have a marvelous time, and she has a marvelous time. And so this is seen through the eyes of someone who is profoundly depressed. Okay, so I will stop there. I've gone far too long. I thought this was going to be shorter than my usual one, so that's a laugh. But anyway, if you're not feeling terribly depressed yourself, in which case you should avoid this book, then look for it and read it. And if your German, like mine, is intermediate, it's still worth making the effort. It's not like trying to read The Magic Mountain in German. So, if I can handle the Kestner book and the Claublund book, so can you. Claublund is spelled Klabund. And you can get an electronic copy of it. I don't think you can of their Zauberlehrling. Anyway, great reads. Anybody who wants to understand Davos, you want to read these 3 books. All right, until next time. Bye.